Macquarie Social Research Institute. So I'm going to talk you through the findings from the Cybersecurity Breaches Survey 2018, and then I'm going to hand you over to my colleague Ava from DCMS, who will talk you through what the government is doing to help organisations become more resilient to cybersecurity. So a little bit about the Cybersecurity Breaches Survey 2018. It's a national survey of UK organisations, so businesses and charities. It's intended to inform the government's national cybersecurity programme. The client is DCMS, but we also engage the National Cybersecurity Centre as well. We've done it for 2016, 2017 and 2018, and we're currently working on the 2019 survey. It became an official statistic in 2017, and we included charities for the first time in 2018. Before that, it was just businesses. So the findings are publicly available. They were published in April. If you want to find out more, if you just Google Cybersecurity Breaches Survey 2018, you should be able to find the full report and infographics if you want any more information. Obviously, I'll just kind of present the headline findings today. So a little bit about what the survey covers. We ask about awareness and attitudes towards cybersecurity. We ask about approaches to cybersecurity, including how much they spend on it, and the nature and impact, including the costs of any cybersecurity breaches. And also, as we go through, I'll highlight any differences by size and sector as well. So what we do, so it's a quantitative and qualitative survey. So the quantitative element is a telephone survey of around 1,500 UK businesses and about 500 charities. And we did the field work before Christmas last year. So it's a range of business sectors. The data is weighted to be representative of the UK business and charity populations. And the results are kind of comparable year on year. We ask similar questions so we can compare trend data, which again, I'll pull out in the presentation. And then we do 50 qualitative interviews, which we did in January and February this year. We followed up with organisations that took part in the quantitative survey, and we also did some interviews with universities as well. So, as we've heard today, cybersecurity is an issue that affects businesses and charities of all sizes and sectors, and any breaches can have substantive financial impacts. So this slide won't come as a shock to any of you. Most businesses and charities in some form are online these days. So the vast majority have email addresses, have websites or blogs. Around 3 in 4 businesses have online bank accounts. About half of charities have online bank accounts as well. And around 6 in 10 have social media pages or accounts. As well, about 20% of both businesses and charities let customers order services online. So it's worth saying that we interviewed a kind of broad range of organisations, so from very small to some larger ones. So 20% is quite substantial, thinking about it when we're including these smaller organisations. And these orange lines at the bottom are just to do with charities. So 30% of charities let people donate online and also allow people to access services online as well. So when we asked them whether they'd experienced a cybersecurity breach or attack in the last 12 months, over 4 in 10 businesses had experienced a breach or attack, and 2 in 10 charities had done so. So you'll see that the larger businesses are more likely to have had a breach or attack. So around 3/4 of large firms reported having a breach or attack, and around 6 in 10 in the finance and insurance sector and the info and comms sector as well. And similarly with the charities, 3/4 of charities with incomes over 5 million had also experienced a breach or attack. So in terms of the type of attacks that they're experiencing, the most common by far is phishing attacks. So 3/4 of all attacks are phishing attacks. You'll see that the incidence of malware attacks has fallen since 2017. So that first blue arrow just relates to businesses, because we only have trend data for businesses. So this just highlights that staff vigilance matters as well as technical controls, which we've discussed earlier today as well. So other things, so the unauthorised use of computers, networks or servers by outsiders, that's gone up 5% since last year as well. And there's various other kind of types of attacks as well. So in terms of not all attacks are successful, and most do not result in a negative outcome for the organisation, but among those that identified breaches or attacks, a sizable proportion do have outcomes. So around 4 in 10 do result in some kind of outcome for the organisation. So the most common type is the temporary loss of access to files or networks. So around 1/4 of those. Software or systems being corrupted or damaged, websites being taken down, not relying on third-party services, permanent loss of files, that kind of thing. And only a small proportion directly result in money being stolen. And among those identified breaches or attacks, over half of all businesses and 6 in 10 charities say the breach impacted on their organisation in some way, regardless of whether there was an outcome. So some new measures needed for future attacks. People might take action in terms of updating their cybersecurity software, even if the attack didn't get through. They might have some staff time to deal with the breach or inform others about it. It might stop the staff carrying out their daily work, and there might be some recovery costs as well. So this slide shows about the average cost of all breaches or attacks identified in the last 12 months. So the circular figures relate to the mean cost of all breaches and attacks, including those with no outcome, and those with an outcome are represented by the squares. So you'll see that the square figures are a lot larger when they do have an outcome. It's more costly. So the average cost of businesses is around 1,000 overall, and then about 3,000 for those with an outcome. And this is quite a bit smaller for charities. So there's about £500 for charities, and then 1,000 for those with an outcome. And the cost increases substantially the larger the business size. So we got up to 22,300 is the average cost for large businesses with an outcome. And this slide is pretty similar, so the square figures are the same. The diamond is the median cost of breaches with an outcome. Obviously, the mean can be affected by some high outliers. So this is more like the typical costs that organisations might face. So the typical cost for a business is around £500, and for charities is about £178. So it's quite low, which might mislead organisations in terms of the risks that they're facing. So most businesses and charities think cybersecurity is a high priority, but senior managers still don't typically get formally involved in this area. So when we asked them whether they were prioritising cybersecurity, 3/4 of businesses said it was a high priority. This increases to 9 in 10 medium businesses and large businesses, and just over half of charities say it's a high priority for them as well. So there's various reasons why they prioritise it or why they don't prioritise it. So if they hold very personal data, they tend to be a bit more conscious of cybersecurity, whereas those that see themselves as offline, even if they're not technically offline, or if they think they have nothing worth stealing or they're too small, they just don't think they'll be targeted, so they don't prioritise it. Having someone senior engaging with cybersecurity is really important. So someone at board level or just a senior member of staff engaging with it and really making that a priority really impacts on the organisation as a whole. When the senior staff are not engaged, it really hinders those who have responsibility for it further down the chain. And it's also about the organisational culture. So if they see it as important to their strategic priorities about what their business is doing overall, they do prioritise it, whereas some others just think it's a burden, it's kind of impacting on their business, and they don't see it as a priority. So when we asked whether they had a dedicated board member or trustee with responsibility for cybersecurity, only 3 in 10 businesses have that, rising to about 6 in 10 of large firms, and around half in the info and comms, and again half in finance and insurance sector have that, and only around 1/4 of charities have a dedicated person. So around 1 in 5 businesses and 2 in 5 charities never update their senior managers on cybersecurity, whether they're just not interested or they're just not having that communication. And the rest is kind of a broad mix of how often they do that. So we're going to talk about the investment in cybersecurity, and this is largely driven by the need to protect data. So this is the average spending, so the average investment in cybersecurity in the last financial year. So this does vary by size and whether it's a business or charity, but generally far more charities than business spend nothing on cybersecurity. So over 2/3 of charities say they spend nothing on cybersecurity, and only 1/3 of businesses say they spend nothing. So the average investment is in the last financial year is around £3,500 for both businesses and charities. And as you can imagine, for the smaller businesses, it tends to be a bit less, so around £2,000. And for medium firms, it's significantly more. It's around £40,000, and this is significantly up from the 2017 survey. So we've seen a lot more medium businesses investing in this area. And again, it's even more for large firms, so around £150,000 they're spending on average on cybersecurity. So when we asked them why are you investing in cybersecurity, these are some of the reasons that they gave. So the top one is protecting customer or donor data. This is particularly important for charities. They're really concerned if people are donating to them, they want to be able to protect that information. So around 6 in 10 charities have that as their main reason. They're also concerned around protecting their kind of trade secrets, their kind of information that they hold. They don't want to have any downtime, so they're trying to prevent that, preventing fraud and theft, protecting staff and systems. That's increased since last year as well for businesses. And protecting reputation or brand is also really important. So especially for the bigger organisations that might be more of a household name, it's a real concern. And then customers or donors increasingly require this information. They want to think their data is being held securely. And then also we've talked about GDPR, so they also have to comply with laws or regulations. So it's worth saying that the qualitative interviews took place in January and February this year before GDPR came into effect in May. So it was seen as quite an effective prompt for organisations to kind of raise it on the agenda. So it was being discussed more at management board level, whereas typically cybersecurity might not be on their agenda, partly because it's a legal requirement and partly because it's got potentially large fines for any breaches. There was a bit of a concern amongst people we interviewed at that point in time that this momentum might be lost after GDPR is implemented in May, but we'll see whether that's the case in this year's survey. So there are a range of approaches to cybersecurity in terms of information and training. So this is 60% of businesses sought information, advice or guidance in the last 12 months, and only 42% of charities did that. So in terms of the information that they want on cybersecurity, they really want it to be summarised, they want it in plain English, they don't want as much jargon. They want it to be clearly aimed at them, so even if the guidance is exactly the same for charities and businesses, the charities in particular want it labelled for them. They will not read something that's aimed at small businesses, they want it to be labelled for charities, and they want it to be more specific information on the latest threats, so really up-to-date information. And they do expect to hear from the government about it, but they also expect to hear information on cybersecurity from established bodies like the NHS, trade associations, or regulators. And then we talked about earlier in the day about cyber essentials. So these top 5 bars that you can see here, they relate to the cyber essentials points. So the good thing is most businesses are doing these. Slightly less charities are doing them. But then when it comes to the bottom 3 that don't relate to cyber essentials, people are not engaging with them as much. But again, as we said earlier, this is self-reported. So whether 92% are actually applying software updates when they're available might not be 100% accurate because it's what they say and it hasn't been verified. Oh, come on. Okay, so in terms of a skills gap, so we asked them about people dealing with cybersecurity in your organisation. Do they have the right skills to deal with cybersecurity and knowledge? So the good news is the majority say yes, they do. 70% of businesses say they do have the right skills and knowledge, and about 60% of charities, but that does also leave 30% of businesses and over 40% of charities who think that the people dealing with cybersecurity just don't have the right skills. So in terms of training then, only 20% of businesses and 15% of charities have had someone attend training in the last 12 months. So this increases to about 2 in 3 large firms have attended training, and 40% in the info and comms and 60% in the finance and insurance sector. So in terms of training, there's various reasons why people are kind of not inclined to put on training, various barriers to it. So this includes things like cost. In terms of like the regularity of kind of implementing training, there's a sense that if it's not done regularly, they might forget about it or not learn or apply what's been taught. So the cost and logistics with face-to-face training sessions were difficult, and some wanted maybe more video training or webinars. And then there was those who didn't see the purpose of it. So those who didn't think cybersecurity was an issue or it didn't affect them, they couldn't really see what value training would add. And this tended to be those who didn't prioritise cybersecurity in general because they just didn't think it would add anything new to what they already knew. So that is the end of my slides. So I will pass you over to Ava from DCMS.
So thank you very much for this opportunity. My name is Ava Ignatuschtschenko. I work in the Department for Digital Culture, Media and Sport. And I entitled my presentation following the very good presentation from Ipsos Mori on the research we commissioned, from knowledge to action. Doesn't mean that we tackled knowledge and we're done with knowledge now, but what I had in mind is twofold. One thing is we are gathering more and more evidence on what the landscape looks like, what we can be doing, what works, what doesn't work. But where we struggle still in government is to really encourage sustainable behavior change. We don't want to keep saying the same things over and over again. And today has been a really good example of us actually all being on the same page in terms of the basic things that everybody should be doing, both on an individual level and an organizational level. So how do we bridge that gap between people knowing what they have to do? I don't think anybody, including my mom or my grandma, would not know what a good password looks like. Yet they're still using a bad password. I keep having friends coming to me and saying, oh, my password is so bad, it's this and this. And I'm just like, I really don't want to know, thank you. But so that's basically what we're focusing on at the moment in our department. But just to start off, or maybe not. Why somebody here speaking about cybersecurity from the DCMS? So we renamed ourselves recently, and you might have noticed when we were introduced, there was still Department for Culture, Media and Sport. We added the word digital, so now D stands for digital, not anymore for department, which is slightly odd. But it is actually a change that was very necessary because more than 50% of the department is now working on digital issues, and we're responsible for the digital economy. And within that, we own in DCMS over half of the objectives of the National Cybersecurity Strategy. So we have a lot of responsibility to implement those points and linking that to the digital economy and actually linking it to digital innovation and encouraging business to be the best in the world in that area. And within DCMS, we've set ourselves our own mission to summarize all of these objectives from the National Cybersecurity Strategy. And that is really to support organizations to do the right thing, to become more resilient, and doing that for a better digital economy, to make sure we can be the best in this field in a secure environment. So how can we do that? Within my team in Centers and Regulation and DCMS, we're particularly interested in what drives behaviors. So where we want to get to is a situation where people and businesses and organizations broadly are taking an approach to cybersecurity the same way they would take an approach to their health and safety. We mentioned different other examples previously, actually taking a risk-based approach to understanding what is my own risk, what is the environment I'm in, and we might have lots of information to support that, giving out threat information, raising awareness, but then making a decision on what I will do about it. So it's quite hard. We mentioned that with Cyber Essentials, for example, is a good example when it comes to patching. It sounds like the right thing to do, and it's very straightforward that you should be patching and updating all of your systems all the time when updates become available. That's not difficult to agree to. However, a lot of businesses are dealing with legacy. They're dealing with a situation where potentially it would put them out of business to implement that fully and do that and update all of their systems effectively. So these decisions will be made even if we tell them, no, you have to do it anyway. And how can we get people to a stage where they can make those decisions in an informed and strategic way, not over-investing in cybersecurity, recognizing that cybersecurity is one of the priorities among others, but at the same time, making an informed decision, so also not under-investing into it. So why do we need a change then? I think we've already answered that throughout today. My presentation doesn't have a lot of text on the slides, so it will be taking ages. There. We do recognize in cyber breaches surveys for us really one of those key parts of the evidence base that there's still an awareness gap. So we do realize it's something that people find uncomfortable to talk about on the street. Again, we're all like-minded people in this room, but if we talk to, I don't know, my mom, she still doesn't quite understand what I'm doing at work. It's very intangible. It's something that is still new, and it's perceived as this thing that either I'm too small, it doesn't affect me, why would anybody target me, or it's so complex, everybody's having breaches, you're telling me it's a when, not an if, so why I can't really to do anything about it. So we're having a lot of perception gaps and issues with how people perceive cyber threats and cybersecurity, even the language. So more and more in my work, I realize that talking about cybersecurity, you already lose some people when you start even using that term because it doesn't mean anything tangible to them. So overcoming that is one of our key priorities, and we do see in the Cyber Breaches Survey has confirmed that, of course, that a lot of organizations are still not taking those basic steps. On the other hand, they themselves might think that, but as we heard, more than 50% are failing in Cyber Essentials when they go through the actual process and being tested. And for instance, when it comes to 10 steps of cybersecurity, they have been around for a couple of years. It's only 14% of businesses and 18% of charities, if I've got the numbers right, who have heard about the 10 steps. Sorry about these odd delays. So that's one of those screenshots from the Cyber Breaches Survey where that we got in addition to the formal report. So that's quite a useful way of having just some of the statistics in one page. And what we see is breaches are happening. Obviously, it's not a problem that anybody can avoid. At the same time, they're not taking the basic measures to protect themselves. So how can we bridge that gap? What we're doing is based on kind of established behavior change strategy. So this is the behavior change wheel, which relates to 3 different elements of what drives behavior change. Don't need to go into detail of that, but basically looking at capability, opportunity, and motivation. Everything has to come together for you to do something when it comes to, for instance, exercising more or eating more healthily. Those things have been quite established in those fields, haven't really been applied in cybersecurity to that extent. And we see that in 5 different work streams. So one is, as I already said, we really need to understand what drives behavior. Cyber Breaches Survey is definitely one of our core products within that. We also have the FTSE 350 Cyber Governance Health Check. So that's specifically for larger organizations and how their boards are behaving, so how governance processes look like. And in addition to that, we started a new piece of research also with Ipsos Mori actually on segmenting the audience. So something we realized is from the findings we just heard, people like different kind of messages that are very tailored to them, even though we're kind of saying, well, everything we give out in NCSC is applicable to everybody. So we need to understand better how we can segment the audience so we can use the right levers and use the right messaging for those different audiences. The second piece is, so we know if we get the evidence base right, we know what we have to do in terms of audiences and what kind of messaging people need. But then we also need to understand what government actually has available. In all the different roles that government has towards its citizens and towards its organizations, are we really using the full range of levers? And that's something that came out recently, especially in terms of assessing how well we're doing on the National Cybersecurity Strategy and trying to see, okay, are there any levers we already have established fora with businesses, for example, Companies House or Charities Commission has established relationships with businesses and charities. Can we use those to actually push some of these messages out and reach those populations that wouldn't come to a conference like this? And we work very closely with the NCSC on that, so we've heard everything about Cyber Essentials earlier, don't need to go into detail of that. But it's really important that government has one voice in this. And in identifying those levers, we're also considering regulation again. So very interesting insights earlier today on that. We have heard about GDPR, the Networks and Information Systems Directive has also been mentioned already. We're reviewing now what are actually the effects, what can we see in terms of the impact, and is there anything more that we need? Do we need other incentives, or how can we make the most out of these regulatory levers and actually drive behavior change based on that and use them for cybersecurity? But all of these things won't help in the longer term when it comes to actually changing the environment, and there will always be new technology, the landscape is changing, new threats. So we're more and more focusing now on also correcting those market failures that we have seen and developing secure by design. One of these areas is the Internet of Things. So we have just published a code of practice which applies to manufacturers and basically sets out a number of principles to how to design IoT and how to design security into IoTs. So we're trying to also lead the field in that, and that's actually something internationally that's quite new, and we're leading the field in that. And then all of that needs to be wrapped in really effective communications. And as I just said, it's really important that all the different government departments are actually working together. So we're working at the moment with the NCSC and Home Office, who are owning cyberware, on one single campaign that we can pull everything together, pull the communications together, and really have one system in how we message, even if we segment the audience, being very consistent and strategic about how we do communications. So that's me. And what would be really interesting is also to get your views on what you think is actually driving behavior change. How can we get to a situation where we have more sustainable behavior change rather than having to keep repeating the same messages again and again and people not listening to what we have to say. Thank you very much.